Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Careening Towards Fascism. I'm Jen.
I'm Sandy.
This week's subject, we're going to be talking about Trump's executive orders, the many executive orders. We're not going to talk about all of them because we'd be here for an extended period of time, but just the subject of executive orders, the significance of the ones that he's been signing, and the significance of the sheer number of them.
Yeah.
Let me just start then by asking, I'll tell a brief little tale. That when we were talking about making this podcast, before we started it, I asked you one day, I said, when was the first moment when you started to think that Trump was reminding you of the Nazis? And you said immediately the executive orders.
Yes, I did.
Why? Why was that the first thing that tipped you off?
For me, it tipped me off is because one of the key aspects of Hitler and the Nazis was their complete disregard for all normal forms of governance. Once they got into power, they wanted to get rid of the guardrails.
Right.
And one way they wanted to do that was basically rule by decree, very similar to executive orders. They had no time for the normalities of government.
Right.
And the Weimar Republic, the government that they were part of, was a democracy. It was it had a Reichstag, which was equivalent of Congress, Parliament, whatever term you want to use. Mm-hmm. And they had a process called rule by decree, which was used for the government in times of emergency. Mm-hmm. And it had been used during the years previous to the Nazis' takeover because of political instability and a whole bunch of other bits and pieces.
Right.
Hitler wanted that power for himself. He wanted to reshape the German state into the Nazi state.
Right.
But because he operated within a political system, there were constraints to his power, which he wanted to get rid of. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to be able to rule by decree. But when he became chancellor, he wasn't given that power because he wasn't trusted with it.
Can't imagine why.
Well, a lot of people wondered why not. And so when he became chancellor, he wanted to reshape the government, but the only way he could do that would be through passing what we will refer to as enabling acts. That would be...
I mean, we're not referring to them as enabling acts. That's what
yeah,
they're actually called,
That's true.
right?
That's what they're called, yeah.
Okay.
But what he would do was he would have to get them passed through the Reichstag, which, as I said before, is the Parliament, the Congress. Mm-hmm. Because to end democracy, he had to use democratic means.
Right.
And
tell me, what was the stated purpose of the Enabling Act at that point?
well, the stated purpose of the Enabling Act was to restore German stability. He felt that the government had been unable to do so. So, and he felt that what needed to happen was a suspense of the legal laws, the legal process of governance, and allow the Nazi cabinet to rule by decree.
Okay, so they could just say whatever, and it would become law. It wouldn't have to go through the Reichstag. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
And it was supposed to be for a 4-year period.
All right.
Because the idea was Germany was in a state of emergency, and there's some bits and pieces we can go into that in terms of the background.
Okay.
Of that.
If you were to give a brief synopsis of why people felt that Germany was in a state of emergency even before Hitler came along, what would you say? How would you describe it?
The consequences of the economic depression, the Great Depression, which interestingly enough was down to tariffs. If you want to draw that little connection, tariffs.
You mean tariffs don't save a country's economy?
No.
Yeah, I can
They
imagine.
Apparently caused a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
The consequences of the economic depression, growing polarization between the right and the left, ongoing street battles between the right and the left,
Right.
and the failure of the moderate political parties to work together to establish a more effective form of governance.
Right.
There was almost a kind of, no one wanted to be carrying the can, as it were, for having to do hard decisions.
Right.
And so when Hitler was appointed chancellor in January 1933 by a cabal of extreme nationalists, reactionaries, whatever term you want to use, he wanted the rule by decree, The president said, nope, not getting it. Calls for elections, and the elections are going to be held in March 1933. Before the elections happen, the Reichstag building itself is burned down.
Right.
The Nazis said, this is the communists. This is a communist plot. The day of judgment is at hand. We need to act right now. With that fevered air of excitement, anticipation, fear, panic, the Germans went to the polls. The Nazis still did not get the absolute majority of votes.
Right.
And they did not get enough votes needed to pass an enabling act.
Okay. So they want to have this enabling act because juicy powers ensue.
Exactly.
But they don't actually have enough of a government to be able to pass it.
Exactly.
So how indeed do we wind up getting the enabling act?
How they get to the enabling act is they have to persuade the various other parties within the Reichstag, liberal parties, moderate parties, regional parties, to support them. They need to get 2/3 of the plurality within the Reichstag to pass the enabling act.
So this needs a 2/3 majority to pass.
This needs a 2/3 majority to pass.
Okay.
They had a 52% cast vote, so they had a simple majority,
but they
not
need
the necessary majority.
Like a super majority.
They need because this was going to be changing the constitution of the Weimar Republic.
Right, okay.
And so they began a campaign of working on the other parties to persuade them to accept this enabling act. Various means of intimidation in some cases, bribery in other cases, appeal to good order, and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah, so they managed to convince enough people
Yes.
to support this.
The 23rd of March 1933 was when the Reichstag met. It met at an opera house, so you can put in your own comments about high drama. And at that point, the deputies of the Reichstag, the Nazis obviously supported it. The nationalists who allied themselves with the Nazis supported it. The communists were not permitted to attend.
Wow.
So they were not there, period.
Wow.
All the other parties, bar one, supported it.
Wow. Just for the sake, would you say it was just for the sake of trying to establish, to return to a status quo, just for stability, just for that, like stability was the main goal here?
That's what they convinced themselves.
Yeah.
So these parties, like the Zentrum was a Catholic moderate party, the largest party in the Reichstag after the Nazis, the socialists and others. They convinced themselves, allowed themselves to be convinced that if they supported the Enabling Act, they would establish a place with themselves and their constituents in the new regime,
Right.
in the new order, because they were more concerned about the possible communist threat and the socialist threat. The SPD, the moderate socialists, were the only party who voted against the Enabling Act.
Right.
The reason why this is important to me, because I have a couple of hobby horses, particularly in social media. Yep, you have been warned. One thing that many members of the right wing, the conservatives, like to do is they like to accuse the Nazis of being socialists, because the name is the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP.
Yeah, it doesn't strike me as a particularly good faith argument. I mean, I don't believe that anyone that actually says that really genuinely believes that the Nazis were socialists.
There were, in the early days of the Nazi Party, one of the schisms was between a form of national socialism that they did believe and the eventual version of socialism, the Nazism, which had no problems with capitalism. You know, Nazis and the capitalists were actually very good allies. But there are good reasons to completely dismiss this.
Well,
but
obviously.
Considering that the leader of the Conservatives in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, himself has used this argument of accusing the Nazis of being socialists. Anytime anyone that crumb turns up any of my social media feeds, I get on my high horse and point out in great detail, and excruciating detail, the socialists were the only ones who voted against the Enabling Act.
Right. They're the only good guys in this
They're
story.
the only good guys. The liberals, the moderates, moderate nationalists, regional parties, all allowed themselves to be convinced that they could work with Hitler
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, most of those parties were disbanded or encouraged to disband by the Nazis within months,
Yeah.
including the Zentrum, the Centre Party.
Yeah.
So the purpose of the Enabling Act, it's in many ways, it is the legal basis of the Nazi state. The Nazi state was a legal construct.
Yeah.
It
It
was
was all done within the law.
It was all done within the law. So the Enabling Act was the legal basis and was passed.
Yeah.
It went through.
And what exactly did it allow Hitler and his government to do? What powers did it give
any
them?
power they wanted, basically. For instance, they could pass laws, dictate laws, decree laws, whatever term you want to use, and they wouldn't have to go anywhere near the Reichstag or the Reichsrat.
Right. It was all of the power lay with
no accountability.
Yeah, no accountability.
Because let's face it, the Hitler cabinet, the Hitler executive is not going to be filled with people who are going to be saying, no, we can't do that, Mr. Hitler.
Yeah, funny that.
you
So
know.
it is essentially established a dictatorship.
Exactly.
It set up a legal means by which Hitler could act as a dictator.
The powers that he had, for instance, he could set up treaties. He didn't need to go through any kind of the process.
Right.
Pass laws, completely suspend the civil rights. The Weimar Republic had been a very well established in terms of civil rights for the states.
Yeah.
So anything the Nazis wanted to do, there was no more guardrails, to use the modern terminology.
Right.
And the parties allowed it to happen. They knew what they were signing up for. This was not going to be. They, like many people, I guess, convinced themselves that the Nazis would work within the confines of established order.
Right. They believed that, these are unwritten rules, but they'll follow them.
Yes.
Yeah. That definitely sounds familiar.
They would see themselves, they saw them, themselves, the Nazis, as being kind of supporting public order.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So let's take this back to the present. So this is what you're picturing when you're seeing all these executive orders being signed, and I can see why, because these executive orders allow the president to basically, not to put too fine a point on it, but it does give them kind of a legal ability to act as a dictator to a certain point.
It does to a certain. The one of the differences would be that the executive orders do have to pass the smell test. They can be challenged.
They can be legally challenged. And can and have been, but from what I understand, and I've only just done some reading on this. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I'm not convinced that anyone in the Trump administration is a constitutional scholar either. That this is something that it's in the law. It was meant in case of emergency.
Yeah.
But there weren't really very clear limits written into the law about what exactly those limits were.
What constitutes an emergency?
What is exactly an emergency? And so most presidents just tried to use it quite judiciously, although over the years, presidents have been using more and more executive orders. And they do it in such a way that it, sounds okay. It doesn't encourage legal opposition. It doesn't encourage public opposition. And if they do it that way, then they can kind of get away with it. So they're starting to increase in numbers. But then Trump comes along, and we all know what he did on his first day. He just bloody sat on his desk and signed one executive order after another. Day one, on his first day in office, he signed 26 executive orders on one day. As of today's Monday, March 3rd, he's signed, and I took this number earlier today. He may well have signed a couple more since then. He signed 81 executive orders. He's like 6 weeks into his presidency.
Yeah.
So 81 executive orders so far. In his entire first term, we're just comparing Trump with Trump here. In Trump's first term, he signed 220 executive orders in his whole term.
Yeah.
He's already signed 81.
Yeah.
Biden signed 162 executive orders in his whole term. Trump's already far surpassed the number signed by all presidents in their first 100 days.
Yeah.
Again, he's only on day 42. Roosevelt signed 93, I guess, in his 100 days. But considering Trump's already at 81 and he's not even halfway there, he's going to surpass Roosevelt.
Roosevelt's
as well.
an interesting example in terms of the historical perspective, because Roosevelt became president, and one of his, he was going to take the United States out of the Great Depression.
Right.
And the fact that he signed so few in comparison
Right.
with Trump, when
Yeah.
Trump is not dealing with a national emergency, he's creating one.
He is creating one.
You know, like
You're not wrong. I mean, and let's look at some of those executive orders that he has signed and the kinds of national emergencies that it's led to. I mean, there's been so many, and they come so fast and in such number
Yeah.
that it's easy to lose track
Yeah.
of what he's done and what he has signed. So again, these were signed within the law, but some have since been challenged by the law.
Yeah.
But none have made it to the level of the Supreme Court. So will these hold up? I guess traditionally in the past, the Supreme Court has just kind of turned the other way,
Yeah.
pretended that executive orders weren't happening, and hasn't really ruled on them. So that would be significant in itself if the Supreme Court does. But we're talking about, let's remember what some of these things were. Pardoning the January 6th
Exactly.
rioters, 1,500 we're talking about. Withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, that was on day one. Denying birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
That's one that's currently being legally challenged, but who knows where that will end. I mean, it has been sort of, it's been put on hold by one of the levels of the courts, but we'll see what happens once it reaches the Supreme Court. Suspending all refugee applicants, no applications from refugees. One of the more well-known ones, eliminating the federal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, all of them. Mandating that the federal government only recognize two sexes, male and female, which is very problematic in a lot of ways, not the least for we live in Canada, and so Canadian citizens are permitted on their passports to have either male, female, or X as their gender. And now what's going to happen to them when they try to go to the States? So many problematic questions around that. Rolling back any kind of drilling restrictions on federal lands. And one of the more significant ones for us right now in Canada, imposing a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico. That's, as of today, just about to come in. We're hours away, apparently, from that finally coming into effect, but that was by executive order. He's also he's used his executive orders to revoke 96 previous executive orders. One of the most significant ones of that, it's one signed by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965. This is one that no president saw fit to ever roll back before. That prohibits federal contractors from engaging in employment discrimination.
Yeah.
But Trump thought he should come along and say, nah, go for it. Discriminate all you like. So he's been using it to do some fairly controversial things. These are not just like housekeeping.
Yeah.
And it's not unusual, I think, for one president to come in and say, to hell with the executive orders of my predecessor. But this is going way beyond that. And he's not stopping.
He's not stopping.
And these are things that normally we'd expect to see the legislative branch getting involved in. The executive branch has basically taken over government and is passing one thing after another. Significant overreach by the estimation of most constitutional scholars.
Well, actually, I would what's been happening is in the last couple of generations or so, there's been an evolution in the power of the president.
Yeah.
People have been talking since Roosevelt in many ways of the evolution of the imperial president. in that the president had gained more power,
Yeah.
often in response to national crisis, the Great
Yep.
Depression, the Second World War, the Cold War. And what Trump is, in many ways, can be seen as a dreadful endgame
Yeah.
of what happens when you do not limit the president.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that Trump's not changing anything. These are things that were always there.
Exactly.
Just like Hitler didn't seize power through some illegal means.
Exactly.
He didn't
Yeah,
become a
yeah.
he didn't become a dictator through illegal means.
No.
He somehow used legal legislation to become a dictator. And Trump's essentially doing the same thing.
And one of the problematic situations has been is the Supreme Court has allowed the evolution of the imperial president in many ways.
Yeah, they seem reluctant to stop it.
And part of the reasoning, I guess, is that Congress itself has shown not to be very effective in governing. You know,
Right.
the continual power games,
Yeah.
the whole business of debt ceiling negotiations,
Yeah, and like
all
the constant, like, government shutdown
Yeah.
threats and things like that.
And, when you compare it with like a parliamentary democracy like Canada or the United Kingdom, where government seems to function and the civil service works within those kind of, to implement policy and such things, there are checks and balances that are maybe more unofficial, but far more effective.
Yeah.
If, for instance, if Justin Trudeau is no longer going to be prime minister because he was allowed to, his party decided, to persuade him to resign, they're holding a leader, he's not going to be the prime minister. The next person, whoever that will be the prime minister. It's a simple process.
Yeah.
In the United States, they had to go through like impeachment and all this kind of malarkey.
Which is very difficult.
And that's going to be the question of what happens when Trump goes too far. Who defines?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I mean, with the significant number of executive orders and with significant controversy associated with them, the Republicans so far have done nothing but cheer him on. They have been, going on the record largely as saying, this is great. He's like getting stuff done. He's he's living up to his promises. He's keeping the promises that he made during the election. This is all great. So they are showing no indication that they're planning to use, because they're in majority in, both parts of Congress.
yeah.
They're showing no interest in putting any limits.
No.
I'm not sure how far is too far. Like if doing away with birthright citizenship, for example, struck me as way too far. Obviously struck, the U.S. courts to a certain point that it was too far. It's been deemed to be illegal at one legal level at least. But, everyone still sat by and said, yep, this is fine with us.
When you realize that the Republican Party began in the 1840s and 1850s, it was emerged out of a movement called the Know Nothing movement. It was a racist, anti-immigration movement. They wanted to preserve white America for Americans.
Right.
And so in many ways, the Republican Party has returned to that original anti-immigration, nativist mindset. And the one I was going to also mention, one of the kind of comparisons is how ineffectual the Democrats have been in response to these challenges, in many ways reminiscent of the parties that you would have hoped would have opposed the Nazis. Like, why didn't the center party know that there was time to be more active, more that the Nazis were becoming much more of a dictatorship. The socialist leadership had been detained. Many of its functionaries were put in concentration camps. Others fled into exile throughout Europe. So they were no longer part of the picture. So
yeah, and we talked a bit about how other parties responded in our last episode. So if you haven't listened to that one, go back and check it out. Complicity and Cowardice. But yes, you make a fair point that the parties, to a certain extent, both in Nazi Germany and now, watch the unfolding of what in many ways could be described as an evolution towards dictatorship, and just let it happen.
Yeah.
the fact that there is this ability to issue executive orders obviously makes it a lot easier to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump came in, did this from day one. It was quite alarming, I think, to a lot of people. Just the sheer number, the broad swath of things that he's applied it to. And I think that from the perspective of what kind of a guy Trump wants to be perceived as, this is right up his alley, right?
Yeah.
Because he wants to be a strong man.
Yeah.
And this is how he is perceived by his base. And what better way to be a strong man than to issue edicts from on high? So not only is he achieving what he wants, he just likes being able to issue executive orders. That's my take.
And I think you're right. That I think there's that sense of the kind of almost like the child who has finally been given the keys to the kingdom, and instead of realizing that what it really means to be an effective leader, what it really means to serve people, he gives into all his extremely, I don't know what kind of language you want to use, his base desires, like passing an executive order to rename the Gulf of Mexico.
Honestly,
like what the hell does that say about your ego?
Some of these executive orders are the most ridiculous things. An executive order that does away with laws that require that outlaw plastic straws.
Yeah.
So he uses an executive order for that. So it's like, it's just every little pet peeve he's ever had. He can now issue an executive order. And some of them are just pet peeves, but some of them are the kinds of things that are going to cause
a lot of pain.
A lot of pain, potential ruination of economies with things like these tariffs. And again, he's just issuing them with a stroke of a pen. No one is saying anything except hooray, apparently. And functionally right now, what we're seeing with how the government is operating in the U.S., what's the difference between how it's operating and a dictatorship? I mean, all government power seems to apparently, at this time, rest with the leader. And yes, there is the potential that there should be other ways that this could be stopped. It's just that none of them are working at the moment.
There's a term called elective dictatorships. Sometimes it's used for governments. Like, I grew up in the UK in the 70s and 80s. And in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher had effectively an elective dictatorship, in that the opposition was so powerless. Whatever she wanted happened.
Yeah. And that was in a parliamentary
And that was in a parliamentary system. It's because, the language we use today, she had a supermajority.
Right. But with the powers of the president, you don't even have the speed bump of Parliament necessarily to stop you.
Because in the UK, eventually it was the Conservatives who brought down Margaret Thatcher because they realised how dangerous she was becoming.
It can be done.
It can be done.
But not the way things are currently structured right now in America. Not easily, at least.
Because the party that should be holding to him account, the guardrails have been set up. As you said earlier, they're cheering him on because he's giving them, people talk about moderate Republicans and good Republicans and all that bloody nonsense. What Trump did was he enabled them. He put them on steroids. The Republicans before him were just, in many ways, just as bad, but they realized they operated in a system where they had to behave themselves. What Trump did is he came like Hitler. They both came along and said, we don't need to, we can ignore the rules. And then the people who should have stopped him, for whatever reason, decided to let him go.
And in Germany, it resulted in a dictatorship. And I'd say in America right now, we have a functional elected dictatorship until either the courts or the legislative branch of the government start to do something to slow this down. You're not going to be able to get rid of executive orders, but They were not meant for the things that they're being used for. And it's not meant to be the sole way to run the government, which right now it has been.
Well, to bring back the examples I said earlier, ruling by decree had been deemed to be an emergency part of the Weimar Republic, powers granted by the president to the chancellor to ignore the Reichstag in a time of emergency. Mm-hmm. And that's how it was used.
Yeah.
Hitler said, okay, I can use it for whatever I want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's exactly what Trump's doing with executive orders. And so far, there's been little pushback.
Yeah.
We'll have to see. At this point, it seems to be a question of one by one challenging specific individual executive orders through the courts. Appears to be the only way to address them at this point. We'll have to see what happens with Congress, whether they feel inclined to do anything about it. Right now, they seem to be happy with how things are going, on the Republican side. Meanwhile, well, we talked about the Democrats last time and where they stand, so I won't get back into that. But it's an alarming thing.
Yeah.
And it's not slowing down.
It's not slowing down.
Why should it? He's having a whale of a time signing these executive orders.
He gets to play a dictator.
Yeah.
He's enabled by a Republican Party who basically seeing him what they've been hoping for, but were too cowardly to do it themselves because they still believed they had to operate within the rules.
Yeah.
And a Democrat leadership that apparently has decided they're going to wait for either the courts to do it or the midterms.
Yeah. And that's a lot of executive orders can get signed between now and then, considering how many we're at.
I'll reiterate the timeline. Hitler becomes chancellor in January, has elections in March, beginning of March, passes the Enabling Act March 20, 3 weeks after the elections.
Right.
The parties are dissolved in a matter of months afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have time. We don't have time to wait here.
No.
Someone's got to step up. And the most expeditious way for that to happen is for the legislative branch to step up, because it's going to take too long for this to go through the courts. And it's not very efficient to have to challenge each executive order one at a time through the courts where they violate the law. A lot of these, of course, don't violate any law, so they'll never be stopped. But are they good policy? Well, that's up to the legislative body to weigh in on, but they're choosing not to.
Yeah.
So we have to hope that that's going to happen at some point, because I don't see, it's not going to be a self-limiting thing. Trump's not going to decide, I have signed enough executive orders, I don't need any more.
One thing that's happening is that the Republicans have been having town hall meetings that have been going very badly for them.
Yeah.
And one of the things I just saw today, apparently Trump was rattling on in Truth Social, that obviously the people who were protesting at these town halls were paid agitators.
Yeah, but are the Republican elected officials going to believe that? Are they going to start to be a little bit scared for their own jobs? Maybe that will motivate them to do something. That's the only thing that will motivate them to do something. That's just the way it is.
The Enabling Act was passed because the political parties believed that they would have a future.
Yeah.
Because they didn't believe that Hitler would turn against them.
Yeah.
Kind of one of the most startling examples of that, the person who appointed Hitler as chancellor, a year later was nearly assassinated by Hitler. Wow. Von Papen. But he still took a job in the regime afterwards. I know you tried to kill me, Herr Hitler, but I'm more than happy to get, as long as I got a paycheck.
That is wild. I mean, is there a huge difference between someone like that and what we're seeing today?
Look at Marco Rubio.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously not too happy with how things are going, but he's happy to take that job and to hang on to it.
Exactly.
So we'll keep an eye on this, obviously, in the weeks to come. There's not a real happy wrap up to this situation, because it's alarming.
It is.
And there's only so many ways that this can go at this point. Yeah. And the executive order is a tool that Trump is delighting in using.
Yeah.
And he needs to be stopped by somebody.
Yeah.
And the American people need to encourage their elected officials to rise up and do that.
Yeah.
Because someone has to do that.
Yeah.
And the American people have to see what's happening as well. Exactly. And to understand the danger of what Trump's doing and the direction he's taking this government.
Exactly.
All right, we're going to, obviously, as I say, we're going to keep an eye on this in the coming weeks. This is obviously going to be an ongoing issue, and who knows what executive order he's going to sign next.
Yeah. Maybe he'll be signing an executive order to end the podcast careening towards fascism.
He might. I mean, I got to say, we've had attention. I don't know who it's from exactly. This is just strictly an aside. But I had a little look at who's been listening to our podcast, and thank you very much to our listeners out there. I'll say hello to whoever apparently is in Russia listening to us right now, because according to the stats, there's someone in Russia, at least one person, maybe more than one, I don't know, who's listening to our podcast. I don't know why. I hope they're just interested in history and politics. And hello, listeners
Hello
in
there,
Russia.
comrade.
I guess we'll find out why someone in Russia has decided to listen to our podcast. Hello also to our listener in New Zealand. Wasn't expecting to have the global reach all the way to New Zealand. So hello to everyone all over the world who's listening to us. We appreciate your support. You can find us on Blue Sky or Twitter at careeningpod. You can also email us if you're so inclined. Our Gmail address is careeningpod@gmail.com. And do feel free to like, subscribe, all those kinds of things, wherever you're listening to this. We'd love to hear from you, so do feel free to drop a comment. And we'll see you next week on Careening Towards Fascism.